Our drone filmed a giant Bigfoot, and now he won't leave us alone. 6 days ago, my assistant spotted it on our thermal camera 8 feet tall, moving through an Oregon ravine with terrifying intelligence. We were just environmental surveyors, mapping remote wilderness. We thought we were safe behind our technology, but after we filmed it, everything changed. The knocks started that night. Our equipment began disappearing. 19-inch footprints appeared closer to our tent each morning. Last night, it touched our tent while we pretended to sleep. The ranger who saw our footage went pale and told us to leave immediately. What happens when the thing you're studying starts studying you back? It matters that you showed up today, because in every heart that still believes in wonder, compassion, and quiet strength, we find each other. My name is Marcus Chen, and I'm a senior environmental surveyor with the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. What I'm about to share happened during what should have been a routine wetland assessment in the Western Cascade foothills this past October. I've spent 12 years mapping ecosystems across the Pacific Northwest, and nothing in my experience prepared me for what we encountered on that property. The assignment seemed straightforward. Document the ecological features of a 2,800-acre tract that the state was considering for acquisition. The land had been privately owned by the Whitaker Timber Company since the 1950s, but never logged. Despite approved permits, the property had essentially sat untouched for 70 years, which made it particularly interesting from a conservation perspective. I was paired with Lily Reeves, a graduate student in wildlife biology who'd been working as my field assistant for the past 8 months. She's sharp, methodical, and has an excellent eye for detail, exactly what you want in this kind of work. More importantly, she's skilled with our drone equipment, which we rely on heavily for initial surveying of large properties. We arrived on site early Monday morning, following old logging roads that hadn't seen maintenance in decades. The terrain was exactly what you'd expect in the Western Cascades: steep ridges, dense second-growth forest, and numerous seasonal creeks feeding into what our map suggested was a substantial wetland system in the property's central valley. "This is going to take every minute of our 2 weeks," Lily said as we unloaded our gear at what would become base camp. She wasn't wrong. The undergrowth was thick enough that even reaching our survey points would be time-consuming, let alone conducting proper assessments. We set up our primary workspace in a small clearing about 50 yards from where the old logging road ended. The spot gave us decent satellite coverage for our communications equipment and enough open sky for drone operations. I've learned the hard way to always establish reliable contact with the outside world before beginning remote surveys. "I'm getting good signals on the Garmin," I told Lily as she assembled our first drone. "We should be able to maintain contact with Salem if anything comes up." She nodded, focused on checking the drone's camera gimbal. This was standard procedure for us: verify all equipment, establish communications, then begin systematic documentation of the site. The property's long abandonment was unusual, though. Most private timber holdings in Oregon see at least some activity every few decades. But according to the state records I'd reviewed, Whitaker Timber had never moved forward with their logging plans. They'd renewed permits several times, but never broke ground. When the company finally went bankrupt in 2021, the land transferred to the state for back taxes. We spent that first morning setting up our grid system for the drone surveys. Lily plotted our flight paths, while I established our ground control points, marked reference locations that help us stitch together accurate maps from the aerial imagery. The weather was typical for October in the Cascades. Overcast, cool, with patches of fog clinging to the ridgelines. Did you see anything interesting in the historical surveys? Lily asked as she prepared for our first mapping flight. She was always thorough with background research. Nothing remarkable, I replied, checking my GPS coordinates against our base. Map. The original timber surveys from the 50s noted some old-growth stands in the higher elevations, but most of this area was logged in the 20s. The wetland system is probably the most significant feature. What we didn't discuss then was why Whitaker Timber had abandoned their logging plans. The company had invested in road construction and surveys, obtained all necessary permits, but never harvested a single tree. The property files I'd reviewed contained no explanation for this decision. Our plan was to spend the first 3 days conducting aerial surveys, creating detailed maps of the property's current conditions. This would help us identify priority areas for ground truthing, the essential but time-consuming process of verifying aerial observations with physical inspection. With good weather, we could cover most of the property with the drone, though the dense canopy would obscure some features. I've always appreciated the methodical nature of environmental surveying. There's something satisfying about systematically documenting a landscape, building a detailed understanding of how water, soil, and vegetation interact across a property. This project should have been no different. Challenging terrain and limited access, but nothing we hadn't handled before. We had 2 weeks to complete our assessment. The state needed our report to finalize their acquisition plans, particularly regarding the wetland boundaries and any protected species habitat. Standard procedure, routine field work. At least, that's what it should have been. The next 2 days fell into our usual survey rhythm. Each morning, we'd review weather conditions and adjust our flight plans accordingly. The drone work was straightforward. Systematic passes over the property at 300 feet, capturing overlapping imagery we could stitch together later. Lily handled the controls with practiced precision while I documented ground conditions and marked reference points. I found another one of those old markers I called out on Tuesday afternoon, kneeling beside a rusted metal stake. In moss, the tag was barely legible. WHT 73 to 142. Whitaker Timber's survey from 1973, I assumed. We'd been finding these periodically, suggesting they'd done extensive groundwork before abandoning their logging plans. That makes 5 we've documented, Lily replied, eyes still on the drone's control screen. But nothing in the files about what data they collected. No, that's what's odd. The state archives have the permit applications and basic property surveys, but none of the detailed assessment reports you'd expect. I photographed the marker and logged its coordinates. It's like they did all this work and then just filed it away. The weather held through Wednesday, letting us complete most of our planned aerial coverage. The property's topography was more complex than the original maps suggested, with numerous small drainages feeding into the central wetland system. The drone's infrared camera revealed several seeps and springs we'd need to investigate on foot. That evening, I was reviewing our data while Lily conducted her nightly equipment checks. She had a meticulous routine with the drone batteries and camera gear that I appreciated. Suddenly, she paused in her work. "Marcus," her voice had an odd tension. "Do you ever feel like something's watching you out here?" I glanced up from my laptop. "How do you mean?" "I don't know exactly. Just this sensation I've had since yesterday." She was rechecking a battery she'd already inspected. "I know we're miles from anywhere, but sometimes when I'm focusing on the drone controls, I get this really strong feeling we're being observed." That's pretty normal in isolated areas, I assured her, though I noticed she was touching each piece of equipment multiple times, a nervous habit I'd observed before. Our brains are wired to look for patterns and presences. Add in the quiet and the dense forest, and it's natural to feel that way. Yeah, you're probably right, she managed. A small laugh. Too many hours staring at screens, I guess. I returned to my data analysis, but I caught her glancing at the tree line several times as she finished her checks. The forest was especially dark that evening, the overcast sky blocking any moonlight. Our LED work light created a small bubble of visibility that made the surrounding darkness feel more absolute. I was heating up our freeze-dried meals when Lily's voice cut through the evening silence. "Marcus, you need to see this." Something in her tone made me immediately set down the camping stove. She had her laptop propped on our folding table, reviewing the thermal footage from that afternoon's drone flights. I leaned over her shoulder, watching as she replayed a segment from our survey of the Eastern Ravine. "There, did you see it?" She reversed the footage a few seconds. "Watch the bottom right quadrant." The infrared display showed the landscape in cool blues and greens, with occasional warm spots from sun-heated rocks. Then I saw what had caught her attention, a distinct bipedal heat signature moving through the undergrowth. The figure crossed the frame in about 3 seconds, its thermal profile bright against the cool forest floor. "Could be a hiker," I suggested, though we both knew how unlikely that was this far from any trails. "Play it again." Lily nodded and looped the sequence. We spent the next hour analyzing those 3 seconds of footage frame by frame. The more we looked, the more unsettling the details became. The figure's proportions were wrong. The torso was too broad, the arms too long relative to its height. Using the drone's calibrated imaging, we estimated it stood at least 7 feet tall. "Look at the gait analysis," Lily said quietly, pulling up a motion tracking overlay. "The stride length and hip rotation. It's not moving like a human." I found myself reaching for my scientific training, searching for rational explanations. Could be artifact distortion from the thermal sensor. Or maybe I've run 3 different enhancement algorithms, she interrupted, touching each corner of her laptop screen in sequence. That nervous habit again. The biomechanical profile is consistent across all of them. Whatever this is, it's real. We fell into tense silence as she exported the GPS coordinates where the figure had been recorded. My freeze-dried dinner sat forgotten as we plotted a route to investigate the location in the morning. The ravine was about a mile from our camp, accessible by game trails if we were careful. "We should document everything properly," I said, trying to sound more composed than I felt. "Full protocol, soil samples, cast any prints we find, photograph everything." "Right," Lily agreed, her voice equally force casual. "Just a normal survey deviation. Standard field investigation." Neither of us mentioned how her hands shook slightly as she marked the waypoints on our GPS unit, or how I triple-checked our satellite communicator's battery level. We went through the motions of planning the morning's expedition like it was any other day in the field, carefully avoiding each other's eyes. We set out at first light, hiking east through the dense understory. The morning dew soaked through my pants as we pushed through thigh-high ferns. Lily walked slightly behind me, consulting her GPS unit every few minutes to keep us on track toward the coordinates from last night's footage. The ravine opened up before us after about 40 minutes of careful navigation. A small creek cut through the bottom, creating a natural corridor through the forest. The morning sun hadn't yet penetrated this deep, leaving everything in a blue-grey twilight. "There," Lily whispered, pointing to a muddy section of the creek bank. I felt my breath catch. The footprint was impossible to miss, easily 16 inches long and proportionally wide, pressed deep into the soft soil. What struck me most wasn't just the size, but the anatomical detail. Clear toe impressions, a distinct arch, a heel that suggested immense weight. "We need to document this properly," I said, pulling out my photogrammetry kit with hands that weren't quite steady. Lily was already setting up scale markers around the print. We spent the next hour taking hundreds of overlapping photos for 3D modeling, collecting soil samples, and measuring depth variations across the impression. I kept trying to find alternative explanations, maybe someone playing an elaborate hoax, though the remote location made that seem unlikely. Perhaps some kind of bear behavior I wasn't familiar with, though I knew that made even less sense. "Marcus," Lily's voice drew me away. From the prints, she stood about 30 yards upstream, staring at something. As I approached, I saw what had caught her attention. 3 stone cairns arranged in a perfect triangle, each about waist high. The rocks were clearly stacked recently. No moss growth, fresh soil disturbance at their bases. These weren't here 2 days ago, I said, checking the drone footage on my tablet. The thermal scan from Tuesday shows nothing in this spot. While I photographed the cairns, Lily wandered to the edge of the clearing. I heard her sharp intake of breath and joined her. Several trees showed fresh damage, massive breaks in branches and bark at around the 8-foot height. The wood was still raw and weeping sap. "Just storm damage," I suggested weakly, even though we both knew there hadn't been significant weather in weeks. Lily didn't respond. She was examining something on one of the broken branches. When I glanced over, I saw her quietly slip several coarse, dark hairs into her sample bag. They looked too thick to be from any known local wildlife, but I pretended not to notice, focusing instead on documenting the tree damage with my camera. The hike back to camp took longer than expected. My mind kept wandering to those footprints, the cairns and the broken branches. I tried focusing on the GPS display, but found myself scanning the tree line more than necessary. When we finally broke through to our campsite around mid-afternoon, something felt off. I couldn't place it immediately. Everything looked roughly the same, but small details nagged at me. The camp stove had been shifted about 6 inches from where I distinctly remembered placing it. Our survey equipment cases, which we always arranged in size order, were slightly out of sequence. "Marcus," Lily called from the food storage area. "Look at this." Our bear canister was still properly sealed and hanging where we'd left it, but something had clearly been investigating. There were scuff marks on the container's surface that hadn't been there this morning, and the rope showed signs of being twisted and pulled. "That's rated for grizzlies," I said, examining the marks. "Nothing should be able to manipulate it like this without breaking the line or dropping the canister." Lily was already unpacking the drone. "We should do another sweep before we lose the light." I nodded, helping her set up the launch sequence. We programmed a standard grid pattern at 200 feet elevation, but this time activated both thermal and optical cameras. The drone lifted off with its familiar whine, and we huddled around the tablet display. About 10 minutes into the flight, Lily grabbed my arm. "They're bearing 0 for 5, about 200 yards out." I squinted at the screen. Something large and dark was moving through the trees parallel to our position. The thermal imaging showed a clear heat signature, but the canopy obscured most details. Whatever it was, it matched our speed exactly, maintaining that consistent 200-yard distance as the drone continued its sweep. As dusk settled, we heated up dinner in tense silence. That's when we heard the first knock, a sharp, wooden impact that echoed through the forest. My head snapped up, meeting Lily's wide eyes across the camp stove. A few minutes later, another knock came from a different direction, about the same distance away. When I shifted position to get a better angle on recording with my phone, a third knock sounded almost immediately from yet another location, as if responding to my movement. This continued for hours. Every time we moved around camp, every time we adjusted our positions or walked to check equipment, the knocks would follow, always maintaining distance, always seeming to track our exact location, despite the dense undergrowth. The precision was unnerving. Whatever was out there didn't just know where we were. It was coordinating, communicating, using the darkness and terrain to stay just out of sight while letting us know we were surrounded. The next 3 days blurred together, in a haze of mounting tension and increasingly bizarre incidents. I woke each morning to find our carefully arranged camp subtly altered. On day 1, my primary GPS unit vanished from its waterproof case, only to appear 6 hours later, perched atop a boulder that would have required technical climbing gear to access. The device was undamaged, its tracking log completely empty. "This isn't funny anymore," Lily said, staring up at where I was retrieving the GPS. "We should call this in." I shook my head. "And tell them what?" "That someone's playing pranks. We need to finish this survey." The second morning, we found fresh tracks. Not down by the creek this time, but in the soft earth barely 30 feet from our tents. The stride length matched the previous prints exactly. I spent an hour photographing and measuring them while Lily paced the perimeter, her hand constantly touching the cedar bundle in her pocket. The knocking had become nearly constant during daylight hours, no longer just responding to our movements. It maintained a steady rhythm that seemed to follow us everywhere we went. Sometimes it came from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to triangulate. I filled 3 memory cards with audio recordings, trying to establish patterns or codes in the sequences. "It's coordinated," Lily said on the 3rd morning, after another night of minimal sleep. "You know it is. Stop pretending this is just bears or locals messing with us." I was reviewing footage from our latest drone flight, trying to ignore how my hands shook slightly. "We need to maintain objectivity. There could be rational. She gestured at my field notebook where I'd documented every incident in obsessive detail. "What's rational about finding my camera hanging from a branch 40 feet up? About the prints that appear inside our perimeter without triggering the motion sensors? About the knocking that follows us everywhere but never gets closer than exactly 200 yards? She was right, of course. I'd been hiding behind scientific terminology and equipment checks, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of normal field protocol, while everything around us descended into impossibility. The truth was, I hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time since finding those first tracks. Every snapping twig, every shadow at the edge of our camp lights sent adrenaline coursing through my system. "We need to move camp," I finally said, closing my notebook. "There's a rocky outcrop, about half a mile up the ridge. Better visibility, more defensible, fewer approach angles to monitor." Lily nodded, already starting to pack up her gear. We worked quickly and efficiently, neither of us wanting to voice the obvious question. What exactly were we defending against? The knocking followed us as we hauled our equipment up the steep slope, maintaining that maddening distance, reminding us with every impact that we were being watched, studied, herded. It took most of the afternoon to establish the new camp. The outcrop provided a commanding view of the surrounding forest, with sheer rock faces protecting our rear and western flank. I set up additional motion sensors and lights, while Lily arranged our tents in a tight cluster near the center of the relatively flat summit. The morning after we relocated camp, I decided to investigate some unusual crashes I'd heard from a small ravine during the night. The sounds had been distinct from the typical forest noise, more deliberate, with a rhythm that suggested purpose rather than random animal movement. I told Lily I'd be back within the hour and headed down the eastern slope, GPS unit tracking my path. The ravine cut deeper than expected, forcing me to use both hands to navigate the steep descent. About 30 yards in, the undergrowth opened up around a massive oak tree that must have been at least 2 centuries old. That's when I saw them. 2 deer carcasses wedged into a fork of the oak's branches approximately 15 feet up. My first thought was that they must have fallen from somewhere higher, but the surrounding terrain made that impossible. The positioning was too precise, too intentional. They were intertwined in a way that spoke of careful placement rather than accident. I pulled out my camera and started documenting, trying to maintain professional detachment. The bodies showed signs of massive trauma, but not consistent with any predator I knew. The bone fractures visible through torn flesh had a distinctive spiral pattern I recognized from my forensics training, the kind that comes from extreme torsion, from something with grip strength far beyond normal parameters. This is Marcus Chen, organ DEQ, time is 0847. I spoke into my recorder, forcing my voice to stay steady. 2 deer carcasses discovered in oak tree fork, approximately 4.6 meters from ground level. No clear access path or drag marks visible. Spiral fracturing present in visible long bones, suggesting application of significant rotational force. Sharp crack interrupted my documentation. Something had struck the tree next to me with enough force to send bark fragments spraying across my jacket. I spun around and spotted a baseball-sized stone lying among the scattered debris. The impact point on the trunk was less than 6 inches from where my head had been. My hands were shaking as I collected the stone, noting its smooth, river-worn surface. There were no cliffs or outcrops nearby that could have launched it naturally. The trajectory had been flat, horizontal, a throw, not a fall. I forced myself to take several photos of the stone and impact site before retreating. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I made myself walk steadily, methodically. Whatever had thrown that stone could have easily hit me if that had been its intention. This was a warning, a demonstration. The knocking started again as I climbed out of the ravine, but different this time, faster, more insistent. I could feel the impacts reverberating through my chest. My scientific detachment was crumbling with each step, replaced by a primal understanding that I was being tolerated in someone else's territory, and that tolerance had limits. I documented everything in my field notebook as soon as I got back to camp, hands still trembling slightly as I sketched the deer carcass's position and noted the GPS coordinates. Lily took one look at my face and started checking the motion sensors without being asked. Neither of us mentioned the possibility of calling off the survey. We both knew we were already past that point. After documenting the deer carcasses incident, I tried to continue our wetland survey work, focusing on a promising area near a natural spring surrounded by dense laurel thickets. The first stone came without warning, a smooth river rock that whizzed past my left ear and embedded itself in a rotting log. I froze, GPS unit half raised, straining to locate the source. The second projectile struck the ground between my feet, kicking up moss and soil. These weren't random throws. Each stone landed precisely where it seemed intended to go. I started backing away from the spring, keeping my movements slow and deliberate. 3 more rocks struck in rapid succession, forming a line that effectively cut off my intended path. What unsettled me most was the physics of it. Some throws came from my left, others from behind or at angles that suggested multiple sources. Yet the accuracy remained consistent. I caught glimpses of movement, dark shapes sliding between tree trunks at 60, maybe 70 yards out. That kind of distance should have made precise throwing impossible, especially through dense forest canopy. But the stones kept coming, each one close enough to feel the displacement of air. I tried 3 more approaches to the spring over the next few hours, testing different angles. Each time, the response was immediate and coordinated. The projectiles formed patterns, lines, arcs, brackets that herded me away from certain areas while leaving others conspicuously open. It felt less like an attack and more like a sophisticated form of territorial messaging. By sunset, I'd retreated to camp, thoroughly rattled but determined to maintain my documentation routine. I photographed each stone I'd collected, noting their similar smooth surfaces and consistent size. The precision of it all suggested intelligence. Methodology, exactly the kind of evidence I'd spent my career learning to recognize in other contexts. That night, I lay in my tent, recording the day's events in my field journal by headlamp. The forest had gone quiet, that unnatural silence that makes your skin crawl. I switched off my light when I heard the first footsteps, trying to convince myself it was just deer or elk moving through camp. The zipper on my gear bag moved first, slow, deliberate. I could hear items being lifted and replaced with careful attention. My breathing seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of my sleeping bag, where I'd pulled my face down to leave just enough gap for air. Then my tent zipper started to move. The sound was excruciating, each tooth separating with methodical precision. Through the thin fabric, I could see the massive shape silhouetted against the moonlight. Fingers far too long to be human manipulated the zipper with surprising dexterity. They moved across the tent wall inches from my face, pressing gently against the material as if mapping what lay beneath. I remained absolutely still, timing my breaths to the ambient forest sounds that were slowly returning. The investigation continued for what felt like hours, every pocket, every seam, every piece of equipment carefully examined by those enormous hands. Not once did they make a threatening move, but the message was clear. Everything about my presence was being catalogued, assessed, understood the next morning. While Lily tried to catch up on sleep after another restless night, I decided to conduct a solo drone flight. My hands shook slightly as I set up the DJI matrix, still rattled from the previous night's encounter. The morning air was crisp, and thin tendrils of mist still clung to the treetops. I launched the drone at first light, focusing on the northeastern quadrant where most of our equipment had disappeared. The thermal camera would be most effective in the cool morning air, and I hoped to catch something, anything that might explain what we were dealing with. 20 minutes into the flight, I spotted movement near a fallen Douglas fir. I switched to maximum zoom and felt my throat tighten. There, partially obscured by branches, was the figure. It was hunched over what I immediately recognized as our missing Trimble GPS unit, worth nearly $10,000. The footage I captured over the next 45 minutes defied everything I thought I knew about Pacific Northwest wildlife. The figure, at least 8 feet tall, when it occasionally stood upright, was methodically examining the GPS unit. Its hands, massive but surprisingly dexterous, turned the device over repeatedly, testing buttons and examining seams with what I can only describe as deliberate curiosity. What happened next made me glad I was recording. The figure retrieved what appeared to be a smooth stone tool from somewhere out of frame and began to systematically disassemble the GPS unit. There was nothing random or destructive about its actions. It carefully separated the battery compartment, removed the internal components, and laid them out in what looked like a purposeful arrangement on a flat piece of bark. I watched transfixed as it spent several minutes studying the circuit board, tracing the pathways with one enormous finger. The level of cognitive sophistication required for this kind of methodical investigation went well beyond anything I'd ever observed in non-human primates. When I returned to camp, Lily was awake but looked terrible. Dark circles ringed her eyes, and her usual energy was completely absent. She'd been having trouble sleeping for days, but this was different. "Marcus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "something's happening to me. The dreams, they're not normal dreams." I set up my laptop to show her the drone footage, but she waved it away, drawing her knees up to her chest. "I keep seeing the forest, but from impossible angles, like I'm viewing it from the canopy or through the root systems, and there's intelligence in it. Something vast and patient that's trying to show me things." She pressed her palms against her temples. "I know how this sounds, but it feels like something is trying to communicate through these dreams. Last night, I saw our camp from above, but not from drone height, from somewhere much higher, and I could feel intention behind the vision, like something was deliberately sharing its perspective. I wanted to dismiss it as stress and sleep deprivation, but after what I'd just witnessed with the GPS unit, I couldn't simply write off her experience. The level of intelligence I'd observed through the drone footage suggested capabilities we hadn't begun to understand. "There's more," Lily continued, her voice shaking slightly. "In the dreams, I can feel its curiosity about us. It's not just watching, it's studying us, trying to understand why we're here and what we're doing with all this equipment." I was checking our vehicle's emergency kit when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone or something had meticulously wrapped long, coarse black hairs around the radio antenna of our Ford Ranger. The hairs were interwoven in a deliberate pattern, not randomly caught like animal fur might be. I carefully unwound one strand, measuring it against my field notebook, nearly 16 inches long. "Lily," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You need to see this." She emerged from her tent, still looking drained, and froze when she saw what I was examining. Without a word, she retrieved sample bags from our kit, helping me document and preserve the hair samples. As we worked, I noticed something else that sent a chill down my spine. A series of sticks, arranged in a precise formation about 30 feet from our camp. The pattern was unmistakably similar to the stone cairns we'd found in the ravine days. Earlier, but this time constructed with fallen branches. Each stick had been stripped of bark and positioned with extraordinary precision, creating a geometric pattern that couldn't have occurred naturally. "This wasn't here an hour ago," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did a perimeter check when I woke up. I pulled out my phone and opened the satellite communicator app. We'd been avoiding this moment, knowing how it would sound, but we couldn't ignore these escalating signs anymore. "I'm calling it in," I said, beginning to type a message to the ranger station. "We need to document everything before we lose any more evidence." While waiting for a response, we launched into a frenzied documentation session. I connected our backup drives and began transferring everything: drone footage, thermal imaging data, photographs, GPS coordinates, and audio recordings. Lily used her phone to video record our verbal descriptions of every incident, starting from the first thermal signature we'd spotted, as I attempted to verify our original footage from the first drone flights. I noticed something disturbing. The files were showing signs of corruption, random pixelation, and audio distortion that hadn't been present during our initial review. I quickly began creating multiple backups, spreading them across different devices. "The thermal imaging files from day 3 are degrading," I said, watching as sections of the footage became increasingly distorted. "It's like something's interfering with the data integrity." Lily leaned over my shoulder, watching as I tried to salvage what we could. "That shouldn't be possible," she muttered. "These are closed systems, not connected to any network." I documented the corruption itself, recording the process with my phone as portions of our evidence seemed to deteriorate before our eyes. The hair samples and physical evidence became even more crucial now. They couldn't be digitally altered or corrupted. The satellite communicator chirped, indicating a response from the ranger station. I held my breath as I opened the message, knowing that once we reported this officially, there would be no going back. Our professional reputations, the entire survey project, everything would be scrutinized through the lens of what we were about to report. The next afternoon, I heard the distinctive rumble of a Forest Service vehicle approaching our camp. Ranger Bill Hutchins stepped out, a weathered man in his late 50s who carried himself with the careful alertness I'd noticed in career law enforcement. He listened to our initial report with professional detachment, jotting notes in a worn, leather-bound notebook rather than the standard issue tablet most rangers used. "Show me what you've got," he said simply. Following us to our makeshift evidence station, I pulled up the thermal footage first, explaining the technical specifications of our drone and imaging equipment. Hutchins's expression shifted subtly as he watched the bipedal heat signature move through the ravine. When I mentioned the data corruption issues, he didn't seem surprised. "Digital equipment can be unreliable out here," he said, touching what looked like an old film camera hanging at his hip. "Let's see the physical evidence." Lily laid out the hair samples, including both the ones she'd collected from the bark and those wrapped around our antenna. Hutchins examined them with latex gloves, his practiced neutrality cracking slightly as he measured their length. "You mentioned stone cairns," he said, his voice carefully controlled, "and stick arrangements." Asterisk, I showed him our photographs and led him to the stick formation near camp. He stood studying it for a long moment, then pulled a file folder from his truck. Inside were black and white photographs from what looked like the 1970s, showing identical geometric patterns constructed from both stones and stripped branches. "This property has a history," Hutchins said finally, "one that got buried in administrative files and rezoning paperwork. The official record says it was abandoned due to unstable terrain and watershed issues." He paused, looking around our camp with new intensity. "That's not why the logging operation pulled out in '74, as he walked the perimeter of our camp. Hutchins's demeanor changed. He stopped at our equipment storage area, going suddenly pale as he noticed something on the ground that neither Lily nor I had spotted: a series of subtle depressions in the soil, forming a distinct pattern. "How long has this been here?" he asked sharply. We hadn't even noticed it," I admitted. Hutchins straightened up, his hand unconsciously moving to what looked like a scar on his left forearm. "I'm strongly advising immediate evacuation of this site," he said. "I'll help you pack out essential equipment. The rest we can retrieve later with a proper team." "But shouldn't we file a report?" Lily asked. "Document everything properly." Hutchins shook his head. "My official report will cite inconclusive wildlife activity and recommend temporary closure for further assessment. Nothing more." His tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. "Trust me when I say that's better for everyone involved." He helped us quickly break down our most important gear, methodically checking sightlines. As we worked, when I tried to press him about the 1970s incidents, he deflected with practiced ease, keeping the conversation focused on evacuation logistics. "The less you officially report about what you've seen here," he said as we loaded the last of our equipment, "the better your chances of keeping your careers and reputations intact. Some things," he glanced at the tree line, "some things aren't meant for official records." As we hastily packed our gear, Ranger Hutchins maintained a vigilant watch on the surrounding forest. His eyes never stayed fixed in one spot for long, constantly scanning the dense tree line in a practiced pattern. The way he positioned himself between us and the forest's edge spoke of someone who'd learned hard lessons about sight lines and reaction time. 15 years ago, he said quietly, checking the tree canopy for the third time in as many minutes, I was part of a search and rescue operation in this same area. 2 experienced hikers, both with decades of backcountry experience, went missing during what should have been a routine 3-day trek. He helped me secure our drone equipment while continuing his story, his voice kept deliberately low. We found them 5 days later in a natural rock shelter about 2 miles northeast of here. Both were alive, but he paused, carefully choosing his words. They weren't the same people who'd started that hike. They were in some kind of catatonic state, barely responsive to external stimuli. The only movement either of them made was to clutch these handfuls. Of course, black hair, the same kind you found. Lily stopped packing her sample collection, looking at the hair specimens she'd carefully bagged. What happened to them? One recovered enough to function somewhat normally, though he never went into the wilderness again. The other? Hutchins shook his head, touching that scar on his forearm again. She's still in a care facility. Never spoke another word. He helped us break down our tent, all while maintaining his systematic surveillance of our surroundings. This area has history that goes way beyond those incidents. The original treaties with local tribes specifically excluded this tract of land, not because the government wanted it, but because the tribal elders insisted it remain unceded. They had names for what lived here, stories passed down about why certain places should remain untouched. Is that why parts of the old-growth sections were never properly surveyed? I asked, remembering the gaps we'd found in the historical records. Hutchins nodded. Survey teams would encounter equipment malfunctions or unsafe conditions. Reports would be filed incomplete or go missing entirely. Even the logging companies stayed clear after '74. He gestured to the dense forest around us. Notice how the second growth stops about half a mile in. Everything beyond that is old growth that's never been touched. Not because it was protected, but because every attempt to access it ended in complications. He pulled out his worn notebook and wrote down a name and number. "This is a contact at the Tribal Cultural Resources Office. If you need to talk to someone who understands what you've experienced, she can help. Just," he glanced at our cameras and laptops, "don't expect to get anything useful from your digital evidence. That has a way of becoming corrupted or disappearing entirely." We worked methodically to pack the remaining gear, Hutchins helping while never breaking his vigilant observation of the forest. He seemed to pay special attention to certain angles and shadows, positioning himself to block our exposure to particular sightlines. The way he moved, the careful attention to our surroundings, it all spoke of someone who'd learned through experience exactly what to watch for and exactly what to avoid. I knew we needed one final drone sweep to ensure we hadn't missed any equipment, despite Hutchins's obvious discomfort with the delay. As I piloted the drone over the area where we'd lost several cases last week, Lily sat beside me, her fever finally breaking after 3 days of concerning symptoms. She looked drained, but more alert than she had been in days. The drone's feed showed clear images in the morning light as I methodically scanned the forest floor. That's when we saw it, standing in a small clearing next to one of our missing equipment cases was a figure that defied every rational explanation I'd clung to over the past 2 weeks. "Are you getting this?" I whispered, hands trembling as I worked to keep the drone steady. Hutchins moved behind us, his breath catching as he watched the feed. For 28 seconds, I know because I checked the timestamp. Later we had a clear, daylight view of something that shouldn't exist. It stood upright, easily 8 feet tall, with proportions that were fundamentally wrong for any known primate. The arms hung too low, the shoulders too broad, the head set directly on massive trapezius muscles with barely any neck visible. But it was the face that destroyed my last hopes of finding a conventional explanation. The features were simultaneously alien and disturbingly intelligent. Deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge-tracked the drone's movement with obvious recognition. The jaw was massive, but the face had a distinctly flattened, almost human-like aspect rather than a protruding muzzle. As it turned to study our drone, the morning sun caught its profile, highlighting details that made my scientific worldview crumble. The sagittal crest, the muscle attachments, the clear signs of a species adapted for raw power, but moving with an unsettling grace. It reached down to touch our equipment case, massive fingers displaying a level of dexterity that shouldn't have been possible given their size. Then it looked directly into the camera, and I felt the weight of an intelligence that knew exactly what it was looking at, without disturbing a single branch. Something that would have been impossible for a human of any size. It stepped backward into the forest and vanished. The way it moved through the dense undergrowth defied physics. Branches that should have snapped or at least rustled remained perfectly still in its wake. "Oh God," Lily suddenly gasped beside me. She pressed her hands to her temples, eyes wide. I remember now, during the fever, I was seeing things, but not hallucinations. I was seeing through something else's eyes, looking down at our camp from the trees, watching us sleep, examining our equipment when we weren't there. Her voice shook as she continued. It was like being inside another consciousness. Ancient, curious, but also, she struggled to find the words, territorial, protective of something deeper in the forest, something we weren't supposed to find. Hutchins placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "We need to go, now." His voice carried an urgency I hadn't heard before. "That footage won't survive the drive out, they never do." But you've seen enough to understand why this place was left alone, why it should stay that way. The evacuation started smoothly enough. Too smoothly, I realized after the first mile. We'd chosen what seemed like the most direct route back to our vehicles, but nature had other plans. Or rather, something was orchestrating those plans with unsettling precision. The first fallen tree appeared across our intended path about 20 minutes into our hike. It wasn't weathered or rotted like natural deadfall. The break was fresh, the wood still oozing sap. Hutchins examined it briefly before motioning us toward an alternate route. "That's not wind damage," he muttered, pointing to the clean break pattern, "and look at the height. Whatever snapped this, did it standing upright." We adjusted our course, only to encounter another fresh blockade 15 minutes later. The pattern became clear. Every time we tried to take what seemed like a more direct route to the logging road, we'd find our path blocked. The tree knocks started again, too, not threatening this time, but deliberate. They seemed to echo from the exact directions we were being steered away from. "It's hurting us," Lily said quietly, clutching her pack straps, like a shepherd with sheep. I powered up the drone for one final sweep, hoping to get a better view of what was happening. The feed showed our position relative to the logging road. We were being guided in a wide arc, rather than the straight line we'd planned. Fresh tracks appeared in the soft earth ahead of us, massive prints that seemed to be showing us the way. There, Hutchins pointed at the screen. At the forest's edge, where the dense canopy met the more sparsely wooded area near the logging road, stood our observer. It held one of our missing equipment cases in its massive hands, not as a threat, but almost ceremonially, like a token or a message. The figure stood completely still, watching our slow progress through the woods. Even through the drone's camera, I could feel the weight of its assessment, measuring us. Our behavior, our willingness to follow its unspoken directions. The intelligence behind those eyes was undeniable. This wasn't just some undiscovered primate acting on instinct. This was a being making calculated decisions about how to manage our exit from its territory. I adjusted the drone's camera for maximum resolution, desperate to capture any final details. The creature seemed to sense my intention. It shifted the equipment case to one hand and raised the other in what was unmistakably a deliberate gesture, not quite a wave, not quite a warning, but clearly intentional communication. Then, in a movement that my eyes struggled to process, it simply ceased to be there. One frame it was standing at the forest's edge, the next it had vanished. The drone's thermal imaging showed no heat signature retreating into the woods, no disturbance in the underbrush, no sign of movement in any direction. It was as if it had simply stepped sideways out of reality. "Keep moving," Hutchins urged, gently pushing us forward. "We're being given a clear path out. Best not to overstay our welcome." We followed the route laid out for us, marked by those massive footprints pressed deliberately into patches of soft earth. Each one seemed placed with purpose, leading us in an arc that would eventually reconnect with the logging road about a mile south of where we'd originally planned to exit. 6 months have passed since we left those woods, and the experience has cost me nearly everything. I spent years building my academic reputation, my research position, my carefully constructed worldview. The university politely declined to renew my contract after I refused to complete the wetland assessment. Colleagues who once respected my methodical approach now avoid eye contact in professional settings. My carefully assembled career lies in ruins around me. Lily moved to Seattle 2 months after our evacuation. She took an administrative position with an urban planning firm, about as far from fieldwork as she could get. The few times I've tried to contact her, she's responded with brief, professional emails that deliberately avoid any mention of what we experienced. I understand her choice. Some memories are easier to manage from the 34th floor of a glass office tower. Ranger Hutchins submitted his retirement paperwork the week after our encounter. Last I heard, he'd moved to Arizona, somewhere with clear sightlines and no trees. As he put it in his final message to me, I suspect he'd been carrying his own burden of knowledge for years before our paths crossed. Now he's chosen desert, horizons where nothing can hide in the shadows. Some truths aren't meant for peer review or academic journals. Some discoveries come with obligations that extend beyond the scientific method. I've come to understand why certain forests remain unmapped, why some territories stay blank on our modern GPS screens. It's not bureaucratic oversight or simple neglect. It's respect for boundaries older than our civilization. Acknowledgement that there are still thin places in this world where the known and unknown brush against each other like leaves in the wind. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story left even the smallest echo within you, consider subscribing. I'll meet you here again tomorrow with another tale that speaks softly to the soul.